The story begins with the boy telling us that all he wanted was to be on par with his brother. He didn't want anything else, he just wanted to catch up and match his strength and magic. But even though he tried hard, his brother always despised him, and that's why they never got along. Changing the scene a few years later, where the boy was grown up and found himself on a dragon battlefield. He was telling his brother that he didn't need his help, and at that instant a dragon was going to kill him. So his brother had sacrificed himself for him. Seeing what had happened, he gets angry and realizes something terrible. Actually, his brother had never hated him for being family, but his brother had always wanted to protect him. So he said that there were no humans left on the battlefield, so before he died he was going to take some dragons, and so he began to scream. The dragons were approaching him, but at that instant, a light began to emerge from the sky, and he quickly realizes what it was. A dragon in humanoid form, and that our protagonist says that this should be the king of the dragons, as the others began to kneel in front of him, and also said that all his companions died just to see them and to kill them, and now he was standing in front of him as if he was nothing. Now the protagonist tells him that he is going to kill him and that he just had to take the opportunity to kill him. At that instant, that dragon began to mention to him that he only wanted to make a deal with him. But our protagonist replies that he would never make a deal with a dragon. So the dragon chief was about to tell him what the deal was about. But at that moment, the protagonist was already making sure to give his counterattack, and he quickly rushed forward and inserted a blow to the dragon. But we see that none of that had happened, since this dragon had apparently disappeared at that instant, and there our protagonist realizes that he was losing his sight by a flash of white light. At that moment the dragon asked him if they should wait a little longer. Changing the scene, the protagonist had woken up in a very different place from the battle, in that he began to notice and said he did not remember that place. But after hearing the speech of a person who was in the front, he began to remember, and that place was none other than the Iridium Dragon Annihilation Academy that had existed a few years ago. But he kept thinking what happened to the dragon and what happened to his brother and the other people who had died, and if they could also return or something like that. So he promised himself that this time he would finish them all off, and that he would never lose his loved ones again as had happened in his previous life. At that moment, while he was going down the stairs, a person asked him if something was wrong. But when our protagonist turned to see who it was, a girl asked him if he was alright, since he seemed a little crazy. Right there our protagonist realizes that the girl was Henith Harpulia, a companion from his past who died protecting him as well as his brother. He also thinks that all this was very strange, since he had never met her in his past life at the academy. After that, Henith tells him that soon the first year conference was going to start and they had to be present. After that, Henith asks the Proto what his name is, to which he answers by introducing himself as Rud Donatos. But Henith wouldn't ask her anymore, because she quickly began to remember what her mother told her, to stay away from idiots who didn't measure up to her family. So she began to point out and mention to Rud several people who were some famous bosses and guild leaders that were in the school. To which Rud replies that he already knew all the guild leaders. At that, Henith tells him that if he wanted to join any guild, he had to wait until 3rd year. She also tells him that she had already chosen Midsummer Flame because her guild leader was one of the greatest mages in the world and her hero to follow. So Rud tells her that she could certainly get into that guild. But after that they had called Henith to the front, as they wanted her to give a lecture for the new students. Rud was waiting for his brother to come out, because they had called the president of the student council. But at this instant another guy named Jeremy Duval, who was a friend of his brother, had come out, and he starts to give the opening speech, to which Rud wonders what would have happened to his brother. At that instant, Rud begins to remember his past and remembers his brother telling him that sooner or later he was going to become the president of the student council of the Dragon Slayer Academy. Seeing everything that was happening, he quickly gets angry and rushes at the boy, and asks him why he had become the president, and what happened to his brother. At that moment, Rud mentioned his brother's name, Isir Donatos, and Jeremy answered that he didn't even know who he was talking about. At that moment Rud began to wonder what was going on there, and if something had happened and he had returned alone. He quickly began to wonder if his brother existed in that world. With the entrance ceremony over, the new students are instructed to go to their assigned classes. At that moment, Rud wonders if perhaps his brother had returned as he had, but that surely his brother had chosen not to go to the academy, and that this option might be more likely than the first. So after that he tells Henith that he was looking for a person and wondered if there was a good way to find out more about that person. To which Henith asks him why he didn't pay the guild to look for that information, and that he could also look in the library, since that was where all the lists of the students were kept. But at that moment Rudd decides to go to the library to investigate. Henneth tells him that they only had 15 minutes before the beginning of the class, and that he didn't want to be late on his first day at the academy. At that moment she asks him why he had been looking for problems with the president of the council. He replied that he was just asking about his brother. Having arrived at the library, Henneth is surprised because she had never attended such a large library. At that, Rudd remembers that he had never been there in his previous life. So they both split up and Rudd went to where the list of students was, while Henneth was distracted by a book of herbs. After searching for several hours, he had found nothing. Rudd wondered what was going on in that place, and if it was the dragon Sartnin who had done that, since that dragon was in charge of controlling the dimension and the void. So after that, he thought that now they had to investigate the situation themselves. After that, Henneth was arguing with the receptionist, telling her that he only wanted to borrow 17 books, to which the receptionist answered that he could not do that, and that he could only take 3. But Henneth, in order not to leave alone, told Rudd to wait for her after she had chosen the 3 books she would take. After arriving at the classroom, Henneth asked him if he had found the person he was looking for. And who was it? He replied that he was looking for his brother. But at that moment, his teacher had arrived and introduced himself as Daniel Gold. Henneth says that he is a high-ranking boss of the big guilds, to which all the students began to fantasize and saying that they wanted to work with the professor. At that instant the professor was telling them that it didn't matter if they had no talent, because he was going to accept anyone who wanted to work with him. Meanwhile, in his mind Rudd thought that all that was a lie, since he had gone through the same hell trying to fight with this guy, and all that guy did was mistreat the students. So after that, the Prota says that now all he needed to do was to practice a little bit with magic. So after that he decides not to go to the dorms yet and go to the training room that he always used to visit when he was young in his other life. Already in the exercise room, there he began to do several push-ups, and after being tired, he says that this was not enough, since there were many people stronger than him. So Rudd decides to do more push-ups, and while he was stretching his muscles quietly, he realizes that a person had entered. So he realizes that it was a friend and ally from his past life, remembering him by the name of Balak Steros, who would later earn the title of King of the Fist. At that, Rudd thinks that he shouldn't mess with that guy now, as by now that guy was too weird and had changed after they had become bigger. So after that, Rudd started doing push-ups and was seeing that everything he was doing, Balak was doing. So he quickly started asking him what was wrong with him, and why did he love doing everything he did. To which Balak replied that when he noticed how perfect he was doing it, he just wanted to copy him. At that moment, Rudd introduces himself and Balak tells him that from now on he will call him Master, since his postures and everything he did fit him beautifully. Then came the fencing class, in the 3rd training camp of the Iridium Academy, where the teacher told them that they could choose any weapon they wanted, but they had to adapt to those weapons. At that moment, Henneth tells Professor Daniel that she wanted to be a sorceress, and asks him why she had to choose a weapon. But the professor answers that she, like the others, had to learn to master the weapons, since the magicians sooner or later have to fight hand to hand in a battle. At that, Rudd, knowing about her future, quickly gives her a dagger and tells her that that would be enough for her to take care of herself up close, and that she could use her mana for ranged attacks. After that, Rudd had chosen a heavy sword, to which Henneth asks her if she is going to choose that sword because no first-year student had been able to master it. Rudd replied that it was because he had used such a weapon when he was a child. After that, Rudd goes to the professor and asks him if he could choose more than one weapon, to which Professor Daniel says yes, but that it would be better to concentrate on learning to master one weapon. But Rudd tells him that he wanted to have multiple primary weapons, to which the professor is surprised, since no student had chosen 3 weapons, rather than just one. At that instant, Rudd had taken in addition to the first sword, a spear and a sword larger and heavier than the previous one, and Rudd says that 3 was fine. The professor had been surprised, since that was not simple talent, and that not many students could balance the weapons in that way. He wonders if that boy was a genius, or if he had experienced some war. After that, Professor Daniel asks Rudd what he did before enrolling in the Iridium Academy, to which Rudd answers that he had worked as a mercenary in order to survive, and that he had lost his family to a dragon. At that moment, Henneth also approaches him to ask him if it was true what he had told the professor about his parents. He answers that both of them had died. Henneth apologizes for what happened and for having reminded him of what happened. But Rudd replies that it didn't matter since it had happened a long time ago. At that moment, they both notice 2 people who were arguing in Class B. It was Balak Steros, who was telling his teacher that in his family they did not use weapons and the only thing they used was pure force. So the teacher replied that she would not allow a student to talk to her like that. At that, Balak just looked at Rudd and said that they were good friends. So after that, Rudd said that he had never met that boy. With the teacher already very angry, Professor Daniel told Balak that he had to take a gun. Otherwise he would have to repeat the year or he would be expelled. At that moment everyone had been surprised, as there was no favoritism there. So quickly Balak says that it did not matter to him, since he with his body could defeat any dragon. But Rudd knew that this kid in the future, if he would become an awesome person. So quickly Rudd thinks that this could not be true, and asks the teachers to please make an exception. But again they tell him no. So Rudd sees some gloves and quickly throws them at Balak and tells him that these are not weapons and that they are just gift gloves from a friend. On the other hand, he tells the professors that lately they were forging steel gloves to use them as weapons. At that, the two teachers decide to give Balak a chance and accept what happened. While Rudd is glad to have saved the situation, since Balak is a very strong ally to defeat the dragons of the world in which he was now, and he thinks that from now on he must be very careful with his actions, as they could affect the development of his future. After that, we see Rudd walking calmly, when he remembers that the first day for the first year students is only theory, so that they can adjust to the classes. He also thinks that it is the perfect moment where the teachers explore the students' abilities. He had already attracted enough attention to be taken into account. After that, they were walking quietly while behind him Henneth and Balak were talking. The boy tells the girl that bringing dishonor to his family would be worse than death. But at that moment, a young student had stood in front of Rudd and calls them idiots. After some discussion between them about what happened, the boy introduces himself as Wilhelm, a B student. He says that he wanted to ask Henneth to go out with them, since she was the only important one in this place. But quickly Rudd tells her friend not to move, and in that Wilhelm, seeing that Henneth did not want to be with them, says that she was just a bitch and that they all had to move out of her way, and starts insulting Rudd and Balak for calling the attention of the teachers. Meanwhile, Rudd thought that in his previous stint at Iridium Academy, there were idiots like this too, and in that we see the Proto's past where all the people laughed that he didn't have a family. But despite that, Rudd was never quiet with any person and always tried to hit back. But as it was now, he didn't want to get in trouble with anyone. But in the middle of the argument, the young student quickly threw a punch at Rudd, which Rudd dodged with tremendous ease and knocked his aggressor to the ground, ridiculing him. Rudd's friends began to laugh, at which point the young student took out his sword to kill Rudd, who, guessing his opponent's movements, decided to demonstrate a skill that Balak had taught him in the past. So he quickly blocks the weapon with his fist without even making a cut, and quickly swings, hitting the boy and knocking him unconscious. At that moment, Balak recognized the stance his friend had used, and wondered how was that possible. But when the teacher had arrived, the friends of the aggressor boy brought out their lies and said that Rudd had attacked him first, to which Henneth began to say that this was not true and explains what really happened. So at that instant, the teacher couldn't believe how a freshman had used only his hands to disarm an attacker and tells Rudd that she wants to see him later. After the teacher leaves the place, Henneth asks our protagonist how he had made that move, and how had he done it without a weapon. At that, Balak says that the adults in his family can do that same move without weapons. But at that point, Rudd thinks he can't tell them that he himself as their friend had taught it to them in his previous life. So Rudd, to throw them off the scent, tells them that he is a whiz kid, while Balak replies that this is worthy of his training master, and Henneth, who still can't believe it, asks him if he was hiding something from them. At that, Balak replies to the girl that as friends they are, she shouldn't be digging into her friend's secrets, to which she replies that they are not friends and that they had not even spent their first day of school together. And as the two continue to argue, Rudd recalls that in their past they argued exactly as they do now. Changing the scene, we see that Rudd goes to the teacher and tells her what had happened, and tells the teacher that he didn't really want to fight with the boys, but that he was insulting his friends and just wanted to defend them. Then that boy took out his sword and started to attack him. He tells her that he just tried to block him and that he was a little excessive with the blow he gave him to knock him out. But the teacher had been shocked, because she had never seen a student as kind as that and who looked worried about his classmates. She also thinks that our protagonist has an exceptional talent. After that, the teacher Daniel from Rudd's class had arrived. He tells his colleague that here would be the meeting. At that, we see the teachers of Class D, Arthur Winston, and the teacher of Class C, Damian Grace. At that, the four teachers begin to discuss about some unnecessary expenses that had been made. Then they agree to start their meeting. At that, the teacher says that she had proposed that, because there were so many talents in the whole school, and the other teachers started talking about each of their students. One says that her students are very good, while the other says that they were just garbage. While they were talking, the teacher says that in her class there is a lunatic, referring to Balak Steros, of the great Steros family, and Henith Harpulia, the second daughter of the Harpulia family of wizards. They began to opine among themselves, until they mentioned Rud Donatos, to which they all began to say that he looked good, but didn't seem like a promising person. So they quickly went to the teacher who had already said that he was an exceptional boy. Besides the fact that he was very strong, he was also respectful and had defeated one of her students, to which everyone was surprised, since the teacher did not say things like that in vain. So after that, Professor Daniel, who was teaching Rud, says that he is her disciple since he was in her class and it would be better for him to stay with him, to which the teacher quickly replies no, as she had chosen him. As these two were arguing very loudly, Professor Arthur breaks the table to make them be quiet. There he explains to them that they could not choose who to stay with, and the students they had, or who they would be with no matter which teacher, and that only the student is the one who chooses his teacher. They could not do anything. So after that, Professor Arthur tells one of the teachers to look where that red kid had come from. Quickly one of them answers that he had come from the city of Dissols, which was destroyed after the incident of the 1,000 forms by a dragon named Kyanil, one of the 7 wise dragons. It turns out that it had been Daniel's teacher who had killed that dragon, and it seems that our protagonist had been the only one of the survivors of that city. So that made the other teachers more interested in him, since that boy should have a grudge against the dragons, and that's why they decide that it would be important to educate that boy. But like Red, there was another student who was extremely powerful. Therefore, Master Arthur says that one is also important. After that, we move to the training room where the teacher told the students that they had better try harder as they were just complaining. But in another corner, Rudd was quietly exercising when he heard Balak's breathing and quickly began to tell him that this is wrong, as it could cause him harm. But at that moment Henith had arrived and asked them how they could last 3 hours exercising without resting. To which Balak quickly answers that it actually happens when a man becomes strong, and takes the opportunity to tell Henith that she is very thin, and we see these two arguing once again. At that instant, Rudd didn't want to listen to the conversation, so he decides to leave. Henith asks him why he left like that, but Rudd replies that he just wanted to buy something to drink, so Henith decides to accompany him while Balak stays behind to continue training. On the way, our boys run into a female student, and there Rudd remembers that this girl had beaten him up severely in the past. After that, he tells us that the girl is actually a 3-sword swordsman, so he quickly tells the girl to get out of his way, but she thinks he was an instructor and replies that she wasn't going out anymore. That girl was throwing a can to distract him and attacks him with a kick, to which Rudd, knowing all his attacks, dodges with tremendous ease. The girl makes a pirouette, but Rudd had caught her. Quickly she attacks once again, and Rudd again had dodged with tremendous ease. The girl, seeing how he dodged her attacks easily, she thinks that he is not just any idiot, and asks him if he also wants to fight with her because she is a recommended in the academy. But Rudd answers that she was blocking their way and that he had come there because he was thirsty and just needed some water to drink. At that moment the girl asks him for his name, to which Rudd answers and introduces himself. At that the girl tells him that she will remember him, and after that, the girl turns around and as she walks away, Henith complains to him for not having apologized. At that Rudd thinks that this girl is still very strong, since she had broken his hand, and Henith, realizing that, asks him to go to the infirmary. After that Rudd explains what had happened to the teacher and tells her that it was only a minor incident. Henith quickly explains that it was a first-year girl with white hair and yellow eyes. The teacher gets angry and wants to teach Rudd a lesson for what happened. Then we see how all the students talk about how a girl had hurt that nice boy. At that, Professor Daniel explains to his colleague that he must act smarter so as not to cause a fuss. He also explains that the teacher of that girl, Arthur, he calms the situation by saying that he will take care of everything, so they must file a complaint to Leon's guardian, and he will ask Arthur to punish her properly. After that they can act. 3 days later, the fencing class had already arrived, where they had told each student to line up with their class, to begin with the combined combat lectures. The teacher was explaining that each student could select the opponents and today they must face Class A against Class B. He was also explaining that there were many teachers watching them and that they were going to grade them. So after that, they call Henith to the fighting arena and she quickly chooses a swordsman, saying that she wanted to fight with him, and he accepts the fight quickly. At that, Rud thinks that her friend is very daring to choose a sword opponent in a melee being a sorceress. Already having started the fight, we see Henneth using fireballs, but that swordsman was covering himself with his shield while saying that it was not that impressive. So after Henneth was throwing many fireballs, the boy kept dodging and said that it was not going to be so difficult for him. At that instant, Henneth had distracted him, and when he had looked forward, the fireballs started to scatter into particles that caused him to have to keep shielding himself from those particles. After that, the boy did not know where Henneth was, so at this instant she had appeared in front of him aiming her dagger at his throat. Finally, Henneth had won the fight, but the boy wondered how a student from a noble family could have won with such careless moves, for he had not expected a sorceress to approach a swordsman in such a way. At that moment it was announced that Henneth was the winner. She turned her gaze upwards where there was a very well-known magician named Liana Chernica. She was the master of the Summer Flame Guild, so Henneth wanted to enter that guild. After that, she went to where Rud was and began to boast about her power. She told him that right now the teachers should be praising her. To which Rud replies that she doesn't have to be doing those things. But then we go to where the teachers were saying that she had a very impressive mage potential. They all thought the same. Then another boy had been chosen for the fight. That boy turned out to be Wilhelm, with whom our Prota had had the altercation. But he decided to choose Rud. Quickly the Prota tells him that he didn't want to fight him, but as he had challenged him, he was going to teach him a real beating. Rud tells him that he didn't want to fight people like him, and after that the teacher informed that the third student who could select his opponent was Rud himself. To which he replies that there weren't many interesting people there, but the only one he really wanted to fight was Balak. So Rud proceeded to call him and tell him to come fight him. Meanwhile, Rud was telling him that he knew his family would never dare fight one of his buddies or anything like that. But what he wanted right now was not a fight between partners. He just wanted to see his skills, and he began to remember that in his other life, his friend was one of the strongest and that he had learned a lot from being defeated by the King of the Fist. So Rud asked him not to be nice to him and not to boil like a coward. Balak, listening to him, said that apparently he knew a lot about his family, and that he would not escape the duel, so he accepted his challenge. But he would not ask him to draw his sword from the beginning, but that he would fight with all his strength and with all his heart. So at that moment the fight had begun. But then we go to the past in which Rud was training quietly when Balak came to visit him, and he told him that he had come to him at the request of his brother, because lately he was out of control. To which Rud replied that he didn't listen to orders from assholes, and that if his brother wanted a fight, he had to come himself. But Balak replied that he shouldn't express himself that way about his own brother, as these two were family. Rud was already angry and asked him, grabbing him by the shirt, if he wanted to fight. And in an instant Balak had knocked him down. Rud told him that he was very strong, to which Balak replied that he was too, just not strong enough to beat him. So again we come back to the present where Rud, thinking that earlier when Leon and Balak had beaten him up, that's when he realized he was useless. But at that point Balak had already gone against Rud, to which Balak tells him that he thought it was going to be the same thing again, and that he wouldn't get caught by him. Rud knew that with this he could not hurt him, so quickly Balak started to activate his attack mode while saying that now he was going to go with all his power. At this instant, Rud begins to remember all the members of Balak's family, thinking that they are talented with martial arts and muscle fanatics. He also says that only he had a technique that he could use. At that instant he would insert a blow to Balak that he felt as if his body was twisting. So he would ask Rud what technique he was using, but still Rud kept counterattacking. To which he wondered when Rud had developed such a technique, yet Rud kept counterattacking while saying that if he was not going to attack him, then he was going to demolish him with blows, so he asked him to please attack him as well. All this Rud did, because Balak had a very strong potential, and in the future he had become the King of Fists. So Rud wanted that potential to shine at that moment. So he tells Balak again to come and attack him, but still it was something he could not do, and he could only keep taking punches from Rud. Several minutes later, Balak began to awaken some of that power and in an instant began to hit Rud with several blows, to which he said that he just wanted to see what he was capable of, and after seeing that he had the advantage, he quickly began to prepare a fist to defeat Rud. And when he was about to give him the punch, at that moment Rud had drawn his sword and quickly inserted a blow in the chest that knocked Balak down. At that instant Rud tells him that he was really strong, but not stronger than him. After that Balak had admitted defeat, as he had forgotten that Rud was actually a swordsman. Then we see how all the people were cheering him, saying that they were impressive, while the teachers who were upstairs say that it was too much, and that the level of those kids was the level of a current hunter. They also said that Rudd had a lot of potential. Then we see the teachers Daniel and Claire talking that Rudd was even able to win without much effort, with movements and postures of a lot of strength and precision. They also highlight Balak's fighting level, that he had also done amazing. At that moment, Daniel began to think that the level of this boy reminds him of his teacher Ain Bryce, of the celestial sword style. He also thinks that it doesn't matter how much of a genius someone can be, because no one could beat that diabolical talent. He then thinks Rudd is a monster, as his skills are honed before he even begins to learn. So the four of them set out to recruit these guys. Now we change scene and see the dining hall in the student cafeteria where Henneth, Balak, and Rudd were. In that, Henneth complains because they don't let them go out to eat anywhere else but the cafeteria. Then they were talking about food and Balak mentions how important it is to consume a lot of protein for the body. At that, Rudd starts to remember that Henneth and Balak are from rich families, so he thinks about how unfair it was for him, having to earn money at the cost of his life. At that, Henneth mentions that both she and Balak could get whatever they wanted from their families, but Rudd couldn't because he didn't have anyone. So Rudd gets very angry and ends up arguing with Henneth. After that, they started to hear a noise, so they quickly turned their eyes and two boys were walking towards them. Rudd already recognized them, since in his previous life he had heard of them, and then we realized that these two guys were the leader and deputy leader of the Chasing Guild and Cloudy Moon. Those guys started talking and said that they had seen the fight and congratulate them for the fight. One of them introduces himself as Roderick, master of the Pursuing Guild. As our protagonist introduces himself, he begins to remember that they are the celestial archer Roderick and Abel, the Moon Shadow. He also thinks that he had not had any acquaintances of that level in his past life, because they had already died when he started working as a dragon hunter. Also, the leader Roderick told him that his friend Abel White was a bit shy, and therefore could not talk much. At that, Henneth and Balak also introduced themselves, and they were praised by the guild masters, to which Henneth asks them why they had come to the students' cafeteria, and Roderick answers that they were also students of this academy, and that from time to time they like to remember old times. At that, Henneth also asks if Miss Lyanna was with them, but he answered that since she had already finished the combat evaluation, there was no longer any point in continuing here at the academy, so she had already left. At that moment, Roderick approaches Rudd and tells him that his partner had been praising him throughout the fight and saying that he was the kind of fighter he needed in his guild. But Abel gets angry and asks his partner to back off, as he was going to mean business. So he had gone to where Rudd was and tells him that all he wanted was to recruit him immediately after graduating. To which Rudd replied that he already knew all that, but that recruiting in that way was not allowed. So he replies that it doesn't matter to break the rule, as long as the recruited has a lot of talent. He also tells him that the Guild of the Cloudy Moon has the perfect scenario to exploit and develop his abilities. But Rudd replies that he is not interested and that he has not chosen a guild yet. At that, they began to tell him that he was going to have many benefits, to which Rudd thought it was not a bad idea, but that joining a guild so soon, they would not let him move freely. So our protagonist proposes a deal to the guild masters. He tells them that the only thing he wanted was for them to look for a person, to which Abel asks him what they would gain if they looked for such a person, and Rudd answers that they would gain a good relationship with him. So the leader, hearing that, answered that he was going to retire and that he was going to try to find that person and send him the information so that he could confirm the missing person. After that, Henneth took out a letter and asked Rudd if he had forgotten the letter that the professor had given him, to which Rudd answered yes and began to remember that in his past life he had not received good news. But when he was about to read it, Henneth interrupted him and told him that there was no need to do so, since it was surely good things that his family would be very proud of. At that, Rudd asks her if she was still upset about what he had said about her brother. At that, Rudd also remembers that Henneth's older sister was in a coma. At that, Balak asks Rudd what kind of person is his brother. He replies by reminding him that his brother was very kind and that he is a very strong person, even stronger than himself. To which Balak replies that he shouldn't worry, because if he is as strong as he says he is probably alive somewhere. After that, Henneth asks them what they were waiting for to open their letters, and she says that she wants to be the first one to read it. He said that she was very impressive, and that if she continued like that in the future she would become a magician that nobody could stop. She looks very happy for all those words from the teachers. After her, now it was Balak's turn, and his letter said that he had very impressive muscles and that if he kept working all those muscles, then he could become even stronger. At that, his classmates were making fun because all they had done was to praise his muscles. When it was Rudd's turn, Henneth pulled the brochure to see what it said, and she was surprised to see that it was different from the one they had been given. After that, Rudd was in the teacher's lounge where they quickly began to treat him kindly and asked him if he felt well at the academy, if he wanted a coffee or some dessert, or if he didn't need a coat, since it was getting very cold outside. But then Rudd asked them if they had called him to choose an advisor. So one of the teachers started to explain to him what he was being called for, telling him that he actually had his art very advanced, and that his potential should be handled by an expert in a certain area. So they would tell him that he could choose any of the teachers as his tutor, and that would be decided on the spot. Rudd began to think that they all had good martial arts, but the one he really wanted to learn was the art of the sword. So he quickly asked his course teacher Daniel to please take him as a disciple, to which Professor Daniel was very happy, but Rudd made one condition, and that was that he wanted to become his main disciple to teach him the sky-piercing technique, and to become the successor of that power. At that, the professor asks him how did he know about it, and Rudd answers that he just knew about it, and asks him if he didn't want to be his teacher, that he just wanted to learn about the sword and that technique called sky-piercing that could split any celestial dragon regardless of rank. Then he remembers that in his past life, the master of Daniel and his brother was a legendary swordsman, and if he did not learn this technique, then what had happened many years ago would happen again. So he had to learn that technique, yes or yes. At that, the teacher asked Rudd why he wanted to learn this technique, to which Rudd quickly replied that it was to protect his loved ones and avenge the death of his family. Then we see a bit of Professor Daniel's past. When he was little, he was running with his mom, and a dragon was chasing them. But even though his mom just tried to protect him, she died and sacrificed herself so that he would live. Then he tells Rudd that regardless of all the pain that was suffered, if a person's reason for having power is revenge, then that person doesn't deserve to be the next heir to the sky-piercing technique. But if it was to protect the important and loved people, he wouldn't refuse. So he tells Rudd that from now on, he will become his main disciple. Also, Master Daniel gives him the idea that all the other teachers could supervise him and teach him their techniques, to which Rudd is surprised, and he knew that this would be very difficult, since learning different techniques from different teachers at the same time would be a problem. So after that, Professor Arthur said that actually, that was not a bad idea. So Daniel would not only be his main teacher, but he would also be the main disciple of all the teachers. At that, Professor Daniel reminds him that that is just an offer, and that only he had the final decision. Then Rudd questions whether it is really right to take the position of the heir to the sky drilling technique and the other teachers as advisors at the same time, as this could alter the reality of his future. So Rudd thinks that in order to do that, he will have to overcome his own limits and become stronger, no matter what the cost. He will become the knight the world needs. Then we change scene and we see Leon. She was badly hurt, and apparently it was because the teacher Claire, 2 hours before, had beaten her up. Claire tells her that just now her extra lessons were starting because of her disciplined actions. So the teacher asks her to raise her guard for the lessons and ends up beating her. After that, Leon gets angry because he thinks Rudd was the one who had ratted her out. This girl starts crying because of what was happening to her because of the little encounter she had with Rudd and because her mother had also scolded her. At that, Rudd was walking around, and he thinks that he never meant to provoke that fight. He also starts to remember that in the past that girl never cried, so he wondered why she was crying. But then he begins to remember that in the past, that girl was quiet as she is now. But after the dragons had killed her mother, she had already become a demon who only wanted to kill dragons. So Rudd, seeing that and feeling guilty, quickly went to where she was and was very angry. She complains to him for having told on her and that now she was going through a very difficult time because of him. To which Rudd replies that he hadn't done anything and asks her to apologize, as he didn't mean to treat her so badly. Rudd offers her his handkerchief and tells her that it was her friend Henneth who had given her away. But Leon takes the handkerchief and tells her that he will accept her apology. To which Rudd replies that he will try to avoid her as much as he can, and at that he begins to remember that this girl in the past had become very strong on her own, so the best thing to do was to stay away. But at that, Leon tells him that greetings once in a while would be fine. To which Rudd is very surprised. At that moment, Leon realizes that this boy was following her, so she asks him why he was doing that. Rudd replies that he was just going the same way. Leon asks him where he was going, and he answered that he was going to the teacher's private exercise room, so Rudd wondered if it was just a coincidence. After that, he had gone to where the door was and had seen that the teacher Daniel was there, so he quickly began to ask what was going on. The teacher began to explain to Rudd that from now on he was going to teach Leon as well. Rudd is disappointed, as that should never have happened to him and that it was a mistake. So Rudd quickly suggests to her that she should learn grappling techniques, since she was using only one sword and he had been watching her. At that, the girl gets upset and tells him that she could also tell on him. Then Rudd began to ask the girl why she did not go with the teacher Claire. To which she answers that she would never go with that teacher since she liked to beat her students under the pretext of self-control, and that she wouldn't go with her even if she were dead. At that, Rudd remembers that in the past, Leon and teacher Claire had a great relationship, and that right now their reality was changing. But the teacher tells them that he has many techniques for them to learn, but there was one main one that they had to learn, since they didn't need much theory about fencing, so he reveals to them that they must first learn sparring to strengthen self-control. To which they were frightened, since the teacher was practically telling them that he was going to give them a beating so that they would learn. Minutes later, they were already on the floor, so the teacher tells him that tomorrow they will continue with the classes, after that the teacher had already left. To which Rudd laments and curses for the beating they had just given him and asks Leon why she had not complained about the teacher. To which she replies that she had not complained, because they were still weak and the teacher was going to teach them. But at that, Rudd thinks that Professor Daniel is actually very nice, compared to Professor Claire. So after that, Leon tells him that he knew a lot about close combat techniques, so he asks Rudd to please help him with that. To which he replies that he was never going to help her. But after he saw that the girl wouldn't come unglued, he quickly took her up on it by saying yes. And then that he thinks that he wasn't doing it because the girl was pretty. He was doing it because it was the perfect opportunity to pay off the debt he owed her, so Leon would regret what he had asked him to do. Minutes later, we see that the boys are outside and Henneth had bought several magic books. To which Rudd says that he just wanted to sleep all day and rest. At that, Henneth gives Rudd the books and he quickly passes them to Balak, who asks him if Henneth had given them to him in the first place, why was he passing them to him now? But Rudd asks him if he had brought money. He says no, and then Rudd reminds him that Henneth had bribed them that if they did everything she told them to do, then she would take them to lunch. So Rudd reminds him that he also had to carry. After that, the boys had already arrived where the dining room was, where Rudd realized something, and that was that this girl was insanely rich. He said he didn't know how they could come to eat in a place like that. Henneth quickly began to look at the menu. Rudd had realized that with the cost of just one plate from that menu, he could eat for a month. Meanwhile, Balak was ordering a lot of meat, and that made Henneth angry, and she says she didn't want to see him eating like crazy like that. But Balak tells her that he had to eat a lot of meat to regain the muscles he lost carrying his things and that he could continue to eat. After that, Henneth gets very upset with him and throws a knife on the table and turns to politely suggest one of his favorite dishes to Rudd. Rudd says that because he has a poor man's mouth, he couldn't tell the difference between the tastes of the dishes. He also thinks that was too weird, since he told her that his brother was missing, she was treating him like a king and that she was feeling sorry for him, and that he found that annoying. At that, Rudd remembered how badly she treated him in the past and that she preferred the new version of Henneth. At that, when Balak wanted to take some more meat from him, at that instant Henneth tells him that if he went near the menu again, she was going to ask to cut off his arm and make him eat it. At that, Rudd thinks he'd better not ask her why she was treating him so nicely. At this instant, Rudd was wondering about the time, to which Rudd realizes that it was already 8 o'clock. And says that it was already too late, since that was the time he was going to train with Leon. Our protagonist went to look for Leon to teach him hand-to-hand combat. At that moment we see Leon, who was waiting for him for 5 minutes, and at that moment Rudd had arrived. To which she began to reproach him because he had not arrived on time. To which Rudd asks her to excuse him, that he was doing something, and Leon asks her if he had eaten something before coming, because he smelled like food. To which Rudd replied that he had left the academy because his friends had invited him to lunch. At that, she had felt bad because she had no friends and because she had never been out to the capital. To which Rudd told her that if she was so eager to see the capital, the other weekend he could take her to see it, and Leon was very excited about the idea. After that, Rudd asks her to do a warm-up exercise, and at that moment Leon excitedly starts to overwhelm him with questions about the capital and about her friends. But Rudd interrupts her by hitting her mouth by throwing a pair of gloves at her and asks her if she is this talkative all the time. She replies that even her mom makes fun of her for talking so much and asks Rudd if he knew the leader of the Dragon Annihilation Troop. But at that, he wonders how in her past life this girl held back so much from talking. Already starting with the training, Rudd tells him that the grappling techniques he will use are Stero style, and to be exact, they are a modified version that anyone could use, since this is a very good technique, which is based on the physical aspect first and foremost. So therefore he would just teach him some technical stances and fighting methods. He also explains that, for example, Professor Claire used a mixture of martial arts from all continents, so this made her difficult to defeat because he did not know how to read her movements, and that to defeat her you only had to try not to receive many blows and only hit her with a few critical blows. To which the girl replies that it is easier said than done, and asks him how he can get fewer hits, if he can barely maintain his defense when fighting against her. So Rudd quickly began to use a step that mimicked the movements of a snake and made it difficult to read her movements. He tells him that he had created that move himself and that it wasn't that easy to learn. To which Leon is surprised and tells her that he is amazing. The girl began to copy the same steps, and Rudd smiling thinks that in reality she is the incredible one, since it had taken him 2 years to design and develop that technique, and another year to master it. But that a genius is one who learns the work of years of hard work in just 4 minutes, just like his classmates did in his past life. But at that Leon asks him if he was doing it right, and Rudd sticks his foot in and lies to her saying that she was doing it very badly, that she didn't remember him telling her to do it with her fingertips. So he asks her to get up and do it one more time, since she had to do it properly, and that he made her work really hard. So after that, he had spent the afternoon trying and the girl was still doing badly, so Rudd had gone to his bedroom where he thought that he had learned all that from his past life, and that sooner or later those people were going to surpass him. Although right now they were just normal people, but in the future they would become the heroes of that place. He also knew that he had to learn something very important, the technique of the sky-piercing sword, and with that take the place of his older brother to kill the 7th dragon. Now we change scene and go to where Rudd and Professor Daniel were. The latter tells him that he actually had good technique, but he still had a long way to go to learn. When Rudd heard that, he said that he was not in a relaxed mood right now, so he quickly began to counterattack against the teacher, but still the teacher was much more superior. Rudd thought that now he only had a few things left to do, so he started using a technique that he saw his brother using on him. Quickly he had backed off and the professor wondered if he was inducing him. At that moment, he began to explain that this technique that he had used was from one of his ancestors and that currently as a teacher, he had nothing to correct him of that technique, and that it is as if that boy had learned this technique from the beginning. To which Rudd was still surprised, and then the teacher began to talk about a technique called the sky-piercing sword, and that in reality this technique was not from his family or anything like that, but that one of his ancestors had passed it down through the generations. So as he was his disciple he had to pass it on to him. Then he explains to him that this technique is transferred to successors and so the technique can be completed. In that he also explains to him that mana is an unrefined life force, and that mana must be stored by training the heart, but that the sky-piercing technique uses these principles in a very different way, drawing and using mana from outside in a unique way. So through this, the successors of this technique manage a large amount of mana accumulated in a subspace called the heavenly spirit, so the heart is used as a conductor, and not for storage. At that Rudd remembers that that drawing that his teacher had was the same one that his brother had in his hand. After that, the teacher asks him if he was not training another mana management technique. And while Rudd answers no, he begins to remember that in his previous life, the mana management he used were the typical alchemy arts that were based on the mage's circle system, and that this is the most significant variable that he is going to experience until now. So the professor asks him to sit down and asks him where he wanted the mark. Rudd quickly replies that he wanted it on his hand. The professor tells him that it was going to hurt a little, but later he would see that it was good. At that instant, the professor began injecting him with mana, to which Rudd began to say that it hurt like it was burning him. But in spite of that, he felt fine, and in that instant he had already reached a place where he had heard a familiar voice, and in that instant he had returned again to where the professor was. Rudd replied that the only thing he thought it was an illusion. But the professor tells him that none of it was an illusion and everything he had seen was real. He also explains that maybe in a month he would be able to get used to the mana. But one moment, Rudd began to use the mana, to which the professor was surprised and wondered if this boy was a monster. Minutes later, the teacher began explaining something very basic, which was the ranks of the technique called sky piercing, and it was the first level. Since he was a novice, a wing appeared. Rudd had started with the novice rank, and the teacher tells him that right now it was up to him if he wanted to become powerful, and the only thing he had to do was to train until he got tired so he could become stronger. After that, Rudd had gone out where he had found Henneth and Balak. At that, Henneth claims him because he had disappeared, and they had to teach the fool Balak. So Rudd asks her how come they hadn't started alone first. But she replies that she didn't want to be with that muscle brain anymore since all he was thinking about was his body. Balak said that none of this was true, since the only bad thing that happened to him was that he fell asleep in the theoretical classes, so he thought that it could be an attack of magic to his mind. Kenneth asked Rudd how he had been doing in his classes with the instructors. He replied that it was very normal, except for the excessive attention they gave him. After that, Rudd began to remember everything that had happened and told Kenneth that nothing had been out of the ordinary. But she had told him that he was lying since she knew that all the teachers had favoritism with him, and asked him if, for example, he had seen Professor Damien without his mask, since she had heard that he had the same phobia. To which Rudd replies that nothing like that had ever happened to him. In that Rudd is remembering that minutes ago, he was in Damien's office, and that just like last time, he had not said a single word during the lesson. Also Rudd thought that if in his other life he had known him more, he would have mentioned some topics to bring up some conversation. But all he knows is that he was one of the first teachers to die. But finally the professor asks Rudd if the tea he was drinking was to his liking. To which Rudd responds by asking him if he had any other tea fragrance. To which teacher Damien replies that he liked to drink Mypri tea. And Rudd realizes that he hadn't even taken a sip of his tea, so after that there was just silence for another 30 minutes until the lesson was over. So after that, Rudd asks Balak how the lesson went with his instructor. To which he replies that he was very happy with his respectable teacher Claire, as she was very strong. And while Rudd recalls that in his past life, they got along very well because they thought the same way about muscles. To which Kenneth tells them that she had fared very badly, as she had been assigned a tutor for magic. And he had told her that fire magic was ridiculous, so she had better choose other kinds of spells. But at that she gets angry because Balak tells her that the tutor was right. She ends up very frustrated because in Iridium there were no fire tutors. And Rudd asks her to calm down, because the Empress of White Flame herself might ask her to become his disciple. After that, a person had arrived behind Kenneth. This boy introduced himself as Jeremy Duval, the president of the student council, and said that he was a great admirer of the 3 prodigies who had entered the Dragon House Academy. To which they were shocked, as they didn't know the student council president knew about them. But Rudd knew him well, as he knew what he had done in his previous life. So Jeremy started to say that he had come there to invite Rudd to join the student council. To which Rudd replies that he didn't need any of that, since he knew all the shenanigans they pulled in the student council. Still, that kid says none of it was true. So Rudd says that whatever, he wasn't going to join since he didn't need to listen to him because he liked to do the solo thing. Rudd said this as he walked away from the scene. So President Duval tells his colleagues to excuse him for the interruption, that he was leaving to continue his studies. At that Kenneth asks him to excuse his friend for such a rude attitude. By the time Jeremy Duval had left, Rudd had returned. Kenneth asked him why he had been so rude to the president of the student council. Rudd replies that he didn't like the guy at all, and even Balak himself says that he had a whiff of danger about him. After that, Rudd explains why he hated this guy so much. He was actually his brother's friend. But there was a cause he didn't want to accept, which was that same guy named Jeremy had forced Professor Damien to commit suicide. Also Rudd knew that this guy was going to cause a mass death in the school. Therefore, he wanted him out of the way before he ended up doing that. He also says that nothing that had happened in his previous life was ever going to happen again. After that, we went to where Rudd and Leon were, and Leon asked him why he was always late, and if he had a bad sense of time, to which Rudd replies that this time he was not late. While these two continue arguing, Leon realizes that they had already arrived in the capital, so he runs out for his first impression. Leon, impressed by so many people, asks him where are they going. To which Rudd replies that she should go to buy something, since all the people he knows come here to do that. So Leon takes him by the hand to run away, and tells him that this way they won't be separated. When they had arrived at the store, she asked Rudd about the dresses, to which he replied that everything would look good on her. So after that, she had put on the dress and decides to buy it despite how much Rudd was bothering her. So she tells Rudd that he also had to change clothes, and that she would buy him something for having accompanied her. At that Rudd replies that he didn't need anything. But still, she says to try it on and get him the best outfit they had. After Rudd had gone to change, she had been left thinking that Rudd was totally different than she thought, and that he was a good person for her to be friends with. So after that, Rudd had shown up, and she was shocked, as he looked great in those clothes. After that, Rudd tells her to get out of that place and that he will pay soon. And at that Leon says that even he had to say thank you to her. After walking through several places, Rudd had invited her to lunch. She asks him if she had to pay again, but Rudd replies that it was his turn and that she had already bought him clothes, so he couldn't be so shameless. But several minutes later, Leon stares at him and thinks who knew those clothes would look so good on him. But then Rudd notices and asks her why she was looking at him so much. But then she mentions that he had said that before starting the academy, He was a mercenary, so she asks him if he had fighting partners. He answers yes, while remembering that he was an active dragon hunter, not a mercenary. But Leon tells him that surely his life and death companions must be as close as family, and that they must do their best to protect each other. So he also asks him if his companions were his girlfriend. But Leon realizes that he had asked a very imprudent question, seeing that Rudd had become very angry, and he replies that they were all mercenaries in the first place, and that they were not family, and asks her if she thought that people like that would treat him as family. He also tells her that those bastards were experts at stabbing him in the back, and that she had no idea what he had suffered because of that. He also asks her how she could think that he could love those people, at that she tells him that she had never met anyone like him before, as he always raised his eyes in disapproval, and cursed constantly whenever he could. But that even so, he had promised to teach her fighting techniques, and was even now looking in a brochure to see where they would go for a walk further. So he was a grumpy pushover. At that, Rudd gets very upset and tells her that he had done everything he could to go out with her, so he'd better go back to the academy. But at that, Leon slaps him on the back and tells him that they still couldn't leave, since his mother always told him that friendship is a relationship where you support and help each other. So that's why she had changed her plans for that day. So she explains to him that she wants him to experience what a real family is. Rudd is very surprised by what this girl was telling him. But at that, Leon explains to him that they will now go home to the Dragon Annihilation Troop headquarters to introduce him to their family members.